The After-Death Journal of an American Philosopher, The Worldview of William James, by Jane Roberts, introduction by Seth, read by Martin John. 6. The Nature of Perception, Consciousness, and the Gifted Amateur. Friday morning, February 25, 1977. Man put his consciousness together in numberless ways and therefore perceive himself and his world in different fashions. Most likely the subjective nature of reality was perceived far differently in previous civilizations. There is no need to call one way superior to another. Each represents a particular focus and psychological mixture, and expresses a unique relationship between man and nature and mind and matter. There are countless casts that consciousness can take. Each civilization, indeed each generation, latches upon one and holds it as its official psychological stance. It is not just that man perceives an objective reality through the tints of such casts of consciousness, so much as that these tints stain reality in a given manner, so that certain effects splash out from the mind to fall upon the objective landscape, as if half-formed shadow images of the mind hit a certain window that invisibly exists between mind and matter. And as the sun is reflected from the outside into a winter parlor, so in the opposite direction the images of the mind, hitting this invisible window, suddenly turn alive and brilliant, casting their reflections brightly out upon the objective world. That is, these casts of consciousness work upon the world in their own particular way, so that objective experience is a mixture of images within the mind and objective material without. Much of our perceptual view of the world is learned, and in a flash we can switch alliances, seeing blades of grass in one instance, eyes feasting upon sweet separate tips, or seeing, instead, a glossy, smooth lawn which is only incidentally composed of grass. The individual blades become almost invisible in the larger perspective framework. The reader can think of many such examples. The musicians' and the artists' worlds are doubtlessly different, for each projects outward those particular nuances of desire and interest that program perception. And though they both share the same physical universe, the differences represent those unique characteristics that make consciousness particular, specific, and personally meaningful. Each person possesses his or her own cast of consciousness, then, which serves as an inner blueprint existing within the mind, and then, at a certain point, becoming fleshed in through objective experience. Certainly there must be something out there to be worked upon, molded, and experienced, but that something is far more plastic, malleable, and giving than conventional practical psychology would lead you to believe. It is as if the private cast of consciousness works upon the objective world landscape by giving it its final, private, definite form, as if before the individual perceives objects, there is instead a field of palpable, malleable pseudo-shapes, The perceptions themselves bring these into focus and form, adding all the dimensions of actuality, depth, color, and so forth, these being projected outward upon the landscape according to each man's particular cast of consciousness. The inner blueprints are themselves tuned into that malleable substance, connected with it through the brain, so that any changes in the blueprints appear outside and vice versa. Thus would imagination and thought work upon the world. The processes are so smooth and automatic, so beautifully executed, that man rarely catches himself in the act of this multiple creativity, as the mind forms the world patterned of objects and events. Yet the creative act can give hints of the processes involved, for here man purposefully forms an intent, an act in the imagination, focuses it through the will, and waits in the faith that a work of art will result. He is equipped with the methods of production, objectively speaking, for he has learned his craft, whether it be writing, painting, sculpture, or whatever. But he often does not know where his ideas come from, or understand how an initial inspiration lasting perhaps only a few moments will explode into a sustained work of art. More than other men, the artist lives and works on faith. Man's continual perception of the world also represents creative abilities that he uses, unknowingly in this case. Friday afternoon, February 25, 1977. I bring up casts of consciousness because while each one is like a screen, it is a screen of twofold function. On the mental or psychological side, it projects ideas and beliefs outward where, at the point of contact, these work upon or slide over the pliable but incomplete field of objectivity, giving them their final form. The outside of the screen, the brain, perceives the finished product. Here we have inner and outer images transposed one upon the other so cleverly that it is impossible to distinguish between the two. Many automatic adjustments take place before this final merging or stiffening of events, for the requirements necessitate certain correlations, so that while each cast of consciousness forms its own picture, that picture is composed of the same physical propensities or physical field from which others also form their realities. In this view, the objective universe would be a bank of physical potentials, not an already rigid objective field, but more of a gelatinous propensity with leanings toward a number of probable shapes, which are formed to the preciseness as consciousness, through its casts, works upon it. The brain, being the outside of that screen, is physical, a part of that objective field, and must conform to its characteristics, while the mind or soul would be the inner mental side. That side projects its images outward, including the brain, which is perhaps the mind's first projection, but it is not dependent upon the characteristics of the objective field basically. It must, however, use such a field to experience physical existence. Consciousness is never stationary. The quicksilver nature of your own thoughts should make this instantly apparent. The mind itself is restless and curious. Concentrating upon one subject alone for only a few moments shows the tension that results as you try to leash or confine your thoughts. Considering this propensity for motion, it may be quite astonishing that consciousness focuses for as long as it does in the physical field, through the body. In life, certainly the intensity of that attention fluctuates. In dreams, for example, consciousness allows itself greater freedom, not having to confine its experience to the strict rules of waking perception. Here the mind or soul is seen as existing basically apart from the objective field of reality. Since the physical field is at least locally continuous, however, it stands to reason that the mind field is also, even while it is focused or experienced through individual minds. To me, at least, it is apparent that all hypothetical points of the universe are conscious at mind level. I do not believe the soul to be simply a point of individual awareness in a vast mind field, however, but a potent activator with its own inviolate cast or particularities through which it will experience any reality. I do know from experience that we move through the mind field as we move through the physical one, and that, at one point, we move out of the range of regular accepted physical objectivity. My presence in your world would be of hallucinatory status in your terms, for the dead are out of tune with the station shown on your screen of reality. We still have mental images. However, these no longer coincide with your space-time coordinates, but go off vertically, so to speak, at the point of death, forming angles of experience in some ways adjacent to yours but no longer connecting. We can experience events that are quite physical to us, but they do not appear in your continuum and are not imprinted there. On the other hand, it is impossible to say where my here is, using usual world references. First of all, the strict orientation of physical consciousness, again, is largely learned, consciousness being infinitely adaptable. So the infant learns to focus its awareness through the nervous system, pinpointing events in time and space. These are initially inner events, however, that affect the objective field in a certain way, forming space-time references. Those times and places require the physical nervous system for objective placement through projection outward onto that exterior medium. The dead cannot physically intrude again without another birth into that system. There's a note from the author, Jane. The last passages dealing with James' remarks about the experience of the dead certainly triggered a vivid experience for me. That night, as I lay in bed, between sleeping and waking, I realized that I was seeing brilliant mental images. I was looking at a slice of life, or a strip like a film. It went up vertically from my eyes, or rather from my vision. The effect was as if a long movie film was held vertically above me. On the film was a sidewalk with people walking along normally, except that they were all walking in the same direction and perpendicular to my vision. The whole strip was illuminated within itself. I realized that the people were normally positioned to themselves. It was the odd angle of the strip to my vision that gave the curious effect. Colors were very vivid, but there was absolutely no sound at all. I forgot what followed and couldn't hold my consciousness clear enough. I only remember that after this I was shown a special kind of camera that took the film. At the time, I also knew that the vision illustrated the passages in James' script. Quote, "We still have mental images. However, these no longer coincide with your space-time coordinates, but go off vertically, so to speak, at the point of death, forming angles of experience in some ways adjacent to yours." End quote. Tuesday morning, March 1, 1977. The dreams of the living make an equally imperfect connection with space-time, for example, also going off at a vertical angle, though in a gentler slope, so that the mental events only cause ripples in space-time, indicating or suggesting shapes in that medium while impressing it too lightly to affect the day's practical reality. The angle of dream events is off, not as precise, so that the dream events hit the space-time continuum in a slantwise fashion. Yet this medium, the objective field, can be considered passive, in that it is willing to be impressed by mental stimuli, susceptible to them, while lacking within itself the stimulation of action. I am making this distinction for your convenience, since you think of the objective field as separate, and as a matter apart from mind, while matter is actually a manifestation of mind. In those terms, however, each stimulus forms a separate habit or induces space-time to be more susceptible to another similar stimulus. Dream images therefore impress space-time too lightly for your waking neurological perception, and the objective field is filled with shapes impressed upon it by thought, but not strongly enough to be actualized. Such dream impressions do serve, however, as initial imprints, which incline the objective medium to take certain patterns over others, and serve to prepare the ground for the later physical manifestation. Dream images and imaginative acts then prepare the way for physical ones, impressing large areas in general pre-shapes which are later filled in. It's as if the mind makes preliminary test patterns that are projections in space-time, but in a ghostly fashion. These dream images, however, are laid upon initial fields of probabilities which are characteristics of the physical medium itself. Thusly, certain images will take better than others, fitting within probability boundaries more easily, and possessing more of the many prerequisite conditions necessary for a fully materialized object or experienced event. Other such images will make scarcely any impression at all. An event fits more precisely into time and an object into space. That is, An event clicks first into its time slot, and an object first into its space slot. Yet there is considerable give and take, and the building blocks of matter are all mental intensities, non-physical intensities, whose impressions must finally be sharp and powerful enough to form knots of energy which are interpreted as objects and events. The mosaics of events necessitate the finest tuning and interweaving of intensities, one with the other, so that these to some extent are inner correlates of the structure of cells and animate matter. Tuesday afternoon, March 1, 1977. The objective field, then, is a medium with the propensity for leaning toward objectivity. It accepts mental stimuli which imprint it, stamp it, and form it into the habitual grooves of nature's shapes. It is manipulatable, gelatin-like, and composed of inclinations toward probable patterns upon which specifics ride. All of this sounds quite dry, yet the intensity of emotions, desires, and intents everywhere rules, and is the primary consideration in the stiffening of probabilities into perceived events. Emotional states are characteristic of all consciousness. States of feeling, perhaps, explains better what I mean, for I am not presuming that a rock loves or hates, but that each physical object is alive, filled with consciousness, and having states of feeling. These states attract certain impressions or imprints and repels others. Wednesday morning, March 2, 1977. I can project my own mental images into your objective field, for example, but they do not take. Instead, they will make the same kind of impression as your dream images do. They register but do not impress the medium enough to form a fully expressed physical actuality. For one thing, at my death, my habitual stamp or mark made by my nervous system became inoperable, and I could no longer impress physical reality in the same way. On the other hand, my own experience went off at a tangent, so to speak, so that in relationship to your world, my focus is at a different angle that does not allow direct intersection with your field of objectivity. That field is on the periphery of my focus. My experience there remains as, say, background memory, important to me as your childhood is to you, but not my present concern. I am the William James that was, but I am no longer William James in the same way that the adult is not the child. Furthermore, I have learned much more about consciousness in general, and my own in particular. Perhaps more important, I recognize the limitations of definitions regarding identity and selfhood, for they are bound to be based upon impossibly confusing misconceptions and misunderstandings that appear as a result of Earth experience itself. Existence in the space-time continuum programs memory and, of course, experience itself. Alive, we are only aware of our time selves. We see ourselves live and grow old in time. We experience the moments and identify our subjective reality with continuity in time. But even in life, we are sometimes almost aware of thoughts and images whirling past us at a rate too fast to follow, and on other occasions of events so ponderous and slow that we seem only to waken to them once or twice in a lifetime. Such experiences hint of the true nature of identity, indicating that part of ourselves that cannot squeeze into the coordinates of recognized space-time. In life, we are aware of only certain pulses of our consciousness, and we form our identity by organizing memory and experience along the line of these pulses. We are quite unconscious of anything happening between them, or of anything happening at the other end of the pole of our own greater identity. There are experiences so far apart in time that we cannot follow. So, in life, our sense of ourselves must be limited. Intimations of immortality do reach us, but through dreams, inspiration, and creativity, by means of the mind field mentioned earlier, and through images that impress us but do not directly intersect with practical physical experience. Thusly, again, my appearance in your world, once mine, would be only of hallucinatory status. But let me clearly explain my meaning here. I would have to impress a mind and nervous system with a picture of my image, and rely upon that living person's intent and desire to project the image outward clearly enough, whereupon the person would perceive it as an aberration. Had I known in life what I know now, I would have looked for other elements in my investigations, seeking proof for the soul's survival through following other, more promising directions. I would have sought more ambitiously for proof of the soul's existence in life rather than seeking for evidence of its after-death existence through communications from the dead. The soul's abilities in life, clearly defined, would in life show themselves to be independent of the body's physical confinements. Therefore, I would have looked even more vigorously for accelerations and extensions of the creative abilities as they appear in telepathy, clairvoyance, healings, and out-of-body travel, and I would have examined those characteristics of mind or soul that display mind's control of matter. For that control is like the artist's unconscious control of his technique. While the artist must learn his craft, however, we are born instinctively knowing how to create matter, as instinctively we know how to breathe. Thursday morning, March 3, 1977. Now, granting the confusion of definitions, I would use Meyer's subliminal self as analogous to the soul, representing that part of man that forms and cushions his living, simultaneously orders the intricate involuntary systems of the body, and brings him information of extraordinary origin. I will have more to say about such information later, but it includes, I believe, the unconscious knowledge of events being formed in the medium of probabilities, and also data concerning events happening apart from the body's location. This subliminal self is the self which forms the twofold screen of mind and brain, and personified, it probably is the source of religion's guardian angels. Its abilities, once you look for them, are everywhere apparent in life, along with its extra-natural characteristics. This subliminal self is the benign, well-intentioned, creative inner self that searches for the species' finest fulfillments, not through survival of the fittest, but through the cooperative development of individual abilities which ever add to man's versatility. It reacts not to the blind events of chance and environment, but in response to inner patterns of development projected into the probable field of objectivity, patterns that act as simulators of the most ideal nature. The human species and all species react in time to the all-pervading patterns of probabilities that coax them toward their best, most advantageous developments. Development not set, however, but rich in choices. This presents a world in which all species are interrelated, not one thriving at the expense of the others, but each contributing to the world picture at any given time in a cooperative venture to which man has become relatively blind. For one thing, science has so objectified the animals that it has closed its eyes to the animals' reality of feeling and, yes, sentiment. Stressing the theories of conventional evolution and its objective considerations, science has completely overlooked the greatest factor in creative life, the very sensations of creaturehood and the vast communications that exist among all species. I do not mean to over-romanticize. Over-romanticization is a far lesser error than an over-objectification that dismisses life's sentiment quality as beside the point, and justifies cruelty to animals by citing distorted evolutionary concepts, while on the one hand denying emotional reality to the animals. Science blithely assigns the worst human tendencies to the animal world when it suits science's fancy, and without blinking an educated eyelid. It scoffs at humanizing the animals or assigning qualities of love or compassion to them, while projecting upon them and their world objectives such as selfish, aggressive, competitive, and so forth. For science, since my time, has compromised itself, and while it was once the harbor of the truth-seeker who escaped religion's dictates and dogmas, now the truth-seeker must steadfastly stand apart from science and religion alike. He is therefore likely to be more of an outcast in your time than mine, and he is also for that reason less informed, generally speaking, since he has less access to the learned journals and less say in recognized foundations. Friday morning, March 4, 1977. Yet the gifted amateur often initiates developments in many fields, since his knowledge is not overstructured. He is not stifled by an over-profusion of facts that in the sciences now spring up like weeds, tomorrow to be trampled underfoot, few surviving to maturity. spindly crops often, barely living through a season before falling beneath a new group of equally valid facts, which in their turn fall by the wayside before the latest variety. Not knowing of this rich harvest of facts, near facts, and temporary truths, our gifted amateur need not tread as cautious a path as the academic specialist, who must respectfully treat each succeeding crop of the facts as the only accepted ones, so that even his most imaginative of theories must serve as a mental basket holding a respectable bed of old facts as well. The gifted amateur goes blithely by, it seems, ignoring such considerations, determined to search for something he cannot define or categorize, but something that he will intuitively recognize when he finds it. An old individual, certainly, often without scientific credentials, cantankerous and eccentric, yet he possesses certain assets that go unnoticed. He need not pretend to preserve one set of facts that are already partially superseded by another. He need not worry about losing face with his colleagues, for more usually than not, the poor fellow has none. And because he must rely upon his intuitions and intents more than most people, he refines and develops these so that they compensate in part for the official knowledge that he does not possess. His nose for truth, then, often lets him follow theoretical sense unperceived by others, and he can often discover a new species of truth since he is tuned into the unusual. The good academic, however, is still searching through known categories and is not as apt to stray beyond those boundaries. I do not mean to deride the professional in any field, but rather to point out the many difficulties that lie in his path, psychological, sociological, and economic. Many of these impediments are caused by the characteristics of any organization devoted to a specific field of inquiry. Sooner or later, such a field accumulates its own body of facts, to which it can become slavishly devoted. These facts are usually isolated, that is, taken out of context to some extent, considered only as they relate to a given discipline, not as they connect with other fields. Such organizations maintain their identity thusly, so that biology, psychology, physics, and other disciplines each have their own facts, even though the facts of one field may contradict the facts of another in important instances. By the time our hypothetical young truth seeker finishes his schooling in the area of his specialty, he is already somewhat compromised and prejudiced in favor of his discipline's accumulated body of facts. His education has cost him a good deal of time and money. The very authority of his academic degree and its social and economic implications is dependent upon the truths of those facts that he has mastered. Any evidence to the contrary, any suspicions of the facts' wobbly integrity, brings our new professional feelings of the deepest dismay. And naturally enough, since by now his financial status and perhaps the welfare of a growing family are at stake, to say nothing of his own self-respect and position in the community. If our truth seeker is true to himself, he continues his search under the most difficult of circumstances. He hopes to discover some new invention, theory, or unifying picture, while hoping against hope that any such discovery will not distract his peers or the dignified body of facts that form the basis of his discipline. He must look ahead and behind at the same time, check his results, and, most of all, train his intuitions to follow known facts so that they do not lead him astray and break the rosy bubble. The gifted amateur has no rosy bubble to break and is often regarded as a fool to begin with. He can afford to dally. His livelihood is not dependent upon his success or failure, and, lacking credentials, he does not fear losing what he does not possess. He can cast a curious eye over the various fields of knowledge, nibbling at what pleases him, following where the intuitions lead, discarding what offends his nature. That nature, with its own idiosyncrasies and individual intents, possesses its own innate direction and focus, its own original caste that has its own methods of organization. So, unwittingly, the gifted amateur is often led to follow a very precise direction. As an ill animal seeks out the proper herb for its own cure, so the gifted amateur can be led to cure his own dissatisfaction with known knowledge. His nature coaxes him to travel through new territories of thought to discover the exact theory or idea that will bring him release and may solve a cultural or philosophical problem at the same time. Often also the professional in one field is the gifted amateur in another, contributing precisely where the world least expects it, and astonishing himself by making discoveries in a field in which he dabbles for pleasure. In such instances, the creative abilities are allowed freedom and are not stifled. In its infant stages, modern science, of course, was quite correct in turning directly to nature away from church dogmas concerning the natural world. Science began with its own Achilles heel, however. It determined to limit its investigation of nature to objective issues and provable hypotheses, relying upon the physical senses and, later, their extensions through instruments. What is a flower? No longer would science rely upon old catalogues and classifications, but actively count the kinds, examine the flowers themselves, rip them apart, tear petal from petal so that nothing escaped examination and scrutiny. But since nature's true significance could not be proven, since aesthetics cannot be diagrammed, since the poet's sentimental identification with nature cannot yield provable facts, science settled upon studying the details, the particulars, and ended up with a very limited investigation of nature. Science lost sight of the fact that some knowledge forever escapes facts categories, existing in a different order entirely, one just as valid and just as demonstrable but in a kind of emotional or psychological equation upon which the validity of facts themselves must ultimately ride. Facts are necessary, useful, and pertinent, but there are also ways of organizing reality that do not rely upon facts exclusively, that unify rather than specify, and that honor variances while also perceiving them as a part of a larger field from which those variances emerge. As far as psychic organization is concerned, facts are manufactured. They are classifications of information about direct knowledge, very useful but second-handed. It's obvious, of course, that all the accumulated facts about roses do not and cannot add up to the direct sense encounter of one person with one rose, or approach the intersection of person with flower that happens when we see, smell, touch, and feel a rose. That experience itself cannot be translated directly into the data we know about the factual rose. I am not here denying the facts about the rose, only saying that the direct knowledge must come first and that the facts will have little meaning without the encounter. The direct encounter happens when the personality intersects with something not itself through sense data that the personality and the something else produce creatively together. For something about the rose itself, something native to it and not to us, does set it apart, a variance in a generalized field. And we must partially accept that encounter and merge psychically with that sensed variance. Hence, knowledge can use facts but not be bound by them, since facts can set up barriers between us and our own experience by programming us to perceive in the light of known facts so that, looking, we see the generalized rose and not the individual unique flower before our eyes. End chapter. That was really good. Thank you. Aloha.